just got to look at that camera back there.
Yes.
We encourage you to write a comment about it. And if you read someone else's comment and you think it's a good thing or a good thought or a question that you may know an answer to, we encourage you to respond. We will keep replying to these comments throughout the week.
Yes, I check them anytime someone comments. I get a notification, so I try to comment. We have the image right here in front of us, so I already see Trish. Hello.
A faithful follower of our church. We appreciate you, Trish.
Yes.
So.
Trish is someone who is always present online. She's so faithful to share our posts. Luke, you were talking about just the importance of sharing.
Right.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I will. So if you're watching this, whether live or after the fact, as you watch, we want you to prayerfully consider someone in your life who may need to hear this, or someone in your life who may benefit from this teaching through Genesis. And if you think of that person, we encourage you to share this video with them. And that's a way that you can be evangelistically sensitive to the people in your life. So if you think of someone who just would benefit from this, feel free to share either this video on your timeline or by sending it to them directly.
Yeah, and one thing I want to try and emphasize is that we're not doing this for the likes, for the shares, to try and get this big number digitally. I think one thing we're really trying to focus on is the people, your friends on Facebook. You don't know who could be impacted by the message. So it's not the fact that like this post or share this. It's the fact that when you share this, someone might be really encouraged by it. Someone might be really touched by what Dr. Wiles says, because we all know he's a phenomenal preacher.
A wonderful
Definitely
teacher, wonderful preacher.
A spiritual gift of his. So
great pastor.
We love what he has to say. So the same way that you would invite your friends into the building if you were here, you can invite your friends digitally to the online campus. So
yeah.
Yes.
So we will get started with Dr. Wiles' teaching in just a little bit. You're going to see a graphic. Nothing is wrong. The stream with Dr. Wiles' teaching will start in just a few minutes. Again, we are so glad you're here, whether you're watching live or later in the week. And you're going to see that graphic. Stay tuned. Dr. Wiles will be up in a few minutes, and we will be back with our study through Genesis.
They might not be ready to switch over yet.
They might not be.
But we are going to keep talking.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
what are we learning about today?
I think we are
continuing through Genesis.
Yes, through that early period of what's going on after the fall and how God is working through his people.
You taught a few weeks ago.
Genesis 3, yeah, I taught about the fall.
How was that?
I loved it.
That's a heavy topic. When you're talking about the fall, when you're talking about sin, humanity, all of that, my goodness.
It is. It's a lot. But it's such an important part of what we believe. Genesis is so foundational to what we do as Christians that I'm so glad we're walking through this book together as a church.
Yes.
And again, not just the people who are here right now, but we know people watch throughout the week for our church.
Yes.
So, again, I think if we're ready to switch over now, I'm going to wave down our guy because I think Dr. Wiles will be up soon. and we will be back with
Yes.
Dr. Wiles.
I'm going to
So-
reply, check the comments, see if anyone new is here.
And I
then,
think we're good.
Yeah, we'll switch back over.
Okay, thanks everyone.
All right, everybody, let's get started today. I want to welcome you to the Pastor's Bible Study today, Wednesday, March 8th edition. And so you have an outline there on the table in front of you if you're here in this room. And we also want to welcome those who are joining us online. I think we have the outline that will be available for you as well as we make our way through our study today. But we're going to look at the most, from an interpreter's perspective, controversial passage in the entire book of Genesis. So we might as well just jump right in the middle of it. And it is, as one commentator said, it's the thorniest passage, and this has to do with some of the imagery, not only in some of the challenges of the Hebrew itself, but just the story that it tells. So let's just look at it. I've entitled it God's Wounded Heart. And so Genesis 6, we're just going to try to do the first 8 verses of Genesis 6, okay? So let's look at that. Let me just read it to you first, and then we'll kind of walk through it. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I've made them." But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Pretty simple, to the point, easy to understand story. Wouldn't y'all agree? Okay. So what we'll do today is, sometimes you have to hold your interpretive views loosely. So we'll try to be definitive and loose at the same time. How about that? So it's a little bit of a dance. So here's how I'd like to address it today. Let's start with the blessing and the curse. When you're reading the first part of Genesis, here, one of the things you got to remember, Genesis 1 through 11 is what some scholars just refer to as prehistory. What they mean by that is that when you look at the ability of human beings to actually write our story, written history, you date that back to about the time of Abraham. Prior to that, it's a little dicey. And so the Genesis 1 through 11 kind of falls into that era of history before there was actually real written history. So even though it's historical, it sounds a little odd to call it prehistory because everything is in the past is historical. What I mean by that is actual written accounts, if that makes sense. So we're in a challenging part of the story of humanity to begin with. But when you read Genesis 1 through 11, one of the things that stands out to me is that there's a tension between the blessing of God and its reality on humanity, and actually all of creation, I guess I would say, and then the actual reminders of the reality of the curse. So, for example, when you're reading in Genesis 5, and you get the story of Seth and his descendants, it's a very encouraging word. It's a very hopeful word. You hear about Enosh, who's mentioned in Genesis 4, Enoch, who's mentioned in Genesis 5, and both of those men are associated with godly lifestyles. They represent kind of the hope, you will, of what's best about humanity, particularly Enoch. And then you get to Genesis 6, and it says that human beings increased in number on the earth. Well, you've got the recounting of that in Genesis 5. You're watching humanity fulfill its purpose. It is multiplying, flourishing, exercising dominion over creation. In other words, all that the Lord prepared for humanity in Genesis 1. And so that's the hopeful side and the blessing side. But then you also have the reminder of the curse. Everybody dies, except for Enoch. Remember, he's the one guy that you find this interesting experience for him. But Genesis 4, the recounting of Cain's story and just how you can just read the descent of humanity. By the time you get to Lamech and the evil that's in existence through Cain's family. And then the reminder of death. So you've got juxtaposed on the one hand, I guess you've got the blessings of God, and then you've got the curse and the reminder of the pervasiveness of sin, okay? In particular, you come to this passage, Genesis 6, okay? So here's what I notice in Genesis 6. If you'll let us start today with verse 5. Let's do that. Verse 5, you have a reference to the wickedness of the human heart, but you also have a word about God's wounded heart. And so the descent of humanity is described in verse 5, and then God's grief is expressed in verse 6. So let's look at the descent first. Look at verse 5. So, we find this phrase in the early part of Genesis, the fact that the Lord saw. The Lord saw what he had done, and it was good. And so that phrase is found for us. So in this text, the Lord saw something different this time. He saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. And notice how Moses puts it. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. In other words, what is being described here is a decay that is beyond recovery on earth. Human beings have multiplied, which is what God assigned them to do. But not only have they multiplied, they've multiplied in their evil and their wickedness, and it actually starts in their hearts. And so the depravity of humanity has taken its toll on the world and on God's creation. And the fact that when God saw everything he did, when you read Genesis 1, when God saw it, it was good. And you even have that contrast in Genesis 6. If you look at the end of verse 2, the daughters of men were beautiful. They were good. So there's this goodness that's in existence, and God saw that everything was good. And now human beings have taken that which is good and have turned it to evil. And the evil is so pervasive, it affects all of humanity. Okay? So their heart is now dark. Now here's something we learn about the God of the Bible. God is, he's not impersonal, he's personal. And he looks at all this, he sees it, and he's wounded. He experiences the pain of it. Look at verse 6. The Lord regretted. Now that's an interesting, I think that's probably a good translation. The old King James Version said the Lord, does anybody remember the word? Repented, it says. Sometimes it's translated the Lord grieved. You can actually use any of those words to translate this word. This word is found a couple other times in the Old Testament. And the idea is that God is lamenting. And his lament turns into a sense of regret. I don't think the text is telling us that God regretted his original design. He regrets how it's all turned out. And it grieves him. It's painful to him. It's a statement of intense anguish. It's one of the saddest verses in the Bible. That God would look at everything he made, and up until this point when he looked at what he made, it was good. Even though he saw evil, even though Cain murdered his brother, so many things have already happened. We now have descended to the point that there's pain in the degradation of humanity. The pain that God experiences is the result of human action, not his action. Does that make sense? The pain is not in his action. The pain is in what human beings have chosen to do with what he's given them. And so it's a sad word about the pain of God. Here's God's response: judgment. And his judgment is going to be swift and comprehensive. God is going to judge the world. He's going to, maybe you can look at it like this, he's going to undo creation. He's going to wipe out part of creation. And I want you to notice how comprehensive it is. Look at what the text says, verse 7. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created. In other words, the people designed to bear my image and reflect my glory, I'm going to wipe them out off the face of the earth, and with them, the animals. And he lists them: the birds, creatures that move along the ground. He says, I grieve that all this has happened, that I even made them in the first place because of what's really happened. And so the Lord pronounces his judgment. All of creation has been affected by evil. And now there's going to be a reset. And God is going to start over. Then we come to God's comfort. As Lamech had hoped back in Genesis 5, verse 28, when Lamech had Noah. Remember, if you look back at chapter 5, verse 28, Lamech lived 182 years. He had a son. He named him Noah, and he said, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. In other words, there's hope in Noah, and there's comfort in Noah. And so actually, notice how the text reads it, verse 8. God has seen what's happened, and look at verse 8. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord saw Noah and was comforted. So Noah does bring comfort, not just to humanity, but he actually brings comfort to God, and he brings hope to God when the Lord saw Noah. Now, I want to talk about the context of all of this and how we got here. The short answer is we don't really know. We're not really sure why it became so comprehensive, why evil became so pervasive. It's very challenging. And that it's particularly challenging because of the introduction to this judgment from God given in the first few verses. So let's go back and look at the first 4 verses, okay? Notice verse 2. Here's how the NIV translates it now. Sons of God and the daughters of humans. You could just say sons of God, daughters of men. There's the contrast, okay? So here's the question. Who are the sons of God? Who are the daughters of humans? And how do we understand what has happened? Okay? So let me give you the short answer first. We're not sure. Okay? We're not sure. And so we're going to hold this a little loosely if we may. But I will try to be as definitive as I can to let you know what I think. But I'm going to do it respectfully because there are some incredible theologians, biblical scholars, who profoundly disagree about this. Now, let me just tell you what some liberal scholars say who don't believe in the veracity of the text and struggle with the whole inspiration of the Scripture to begin with. They will point to this and say, well, obviously, this is an ancient myth. Very little difference between Greek mythology and the Gilgamesh epic of the Babylonians and those kinds of things. Here's an example of it in Israel. Sons of God marrying daughters of men, and you've got giants. Okay. So I'm going to discount that one because I don't feel like I have to address that view today. Let me give you the 3 options that have been a part of interpretive history with Jews to begin with, and then eventually Christian theologians, knowing that there's a great deal of disagreement here. So, one view is that the sons of God are the sons of Seth. In other words, this is the line of promise. These are the godly children of Adam through his son Seth. The daughters of humans are the daughters of Cain. They are part of the the descent of humanity, a part of the degrading story of humanity. And they should have remained separate because the Cain's family was moving in one direction and Seth's family is moving in another. I would tell you that that particular view became popular in the 4th century and beyond in Christian history. The reason for that is that was Augustine's interpretation. And if you're familiar with Augustine, he was a bishop in North Africa, a brilliant theologian. And so Augustine believed that this is the understanding of this text, and that you've got the godly line mixing with the ungodly line, the wicked line, and God is going to watch that unfold. And unfortunately, the wicked line is going to pervert the godly line, somewhat similar to when Israel will move into the land of Canaan, and God is going to tell them, don't pollute yourselves by intermarrying with all the wicked people in Canaan. The Jews will do that, you know. And unfortunately, instead of the wicked becoming more godly, the godly became more wicked. Does that make sense? So that's kind of that understanding. That particular view prevailed, I would say, for much of Christian history. Through the time of Luther and Calvin, the reformers, many of them, that's their view of this story, okay? There's another view that is a little more modern, that some modern theologians embrace. It also has some history in Christian thought, and that is that the sons of God are actually these rulers, these despots who had opportunity to lead people. Maybe when you read the story of Cain's descendants, they're building cities, and these cities have leaders and rulers, and these rulers violated every principle that you can think of that would have been given by God. And the daughters of humans, they could come from either Cain's line or Seth's line, but the point is that these rulers had harems, and they introduced polygamy to the history of humanity. And sometimes there's evidence in other cultures referring to rulers as gods or sons of gods, that kind of thing. And so perhaps that's really what this is about. It's about despots, rulers who had harems and multiple wives, and so they had an influence on the areas in which they led and ruled, and the pervasiveness of their sin penetrated their particular cultural expression as well. Number of scholars today actually embrace that view. The oldest view, the view of Jewish interpreters of this story that date back to the 2nd century BC, and the oldest view of the early Christian theologians. When you look at the development of Christian theology in the early days, once the apostles die, when you end the apostolic era and the gospel is handed off to the next generation of theologians and biblical teachers and evangelists, well, you had different people who emerged to continue to give shape and theological reflection. Some of them were apologists. Some of them wrote edificatory writings. They edified the church. Some of them dealt with really complex theological issues. But even the early Latin fathers go all the way to the teachings of Ambrose up into the 3rd century. Almost unanimously, that entire crowd of people adopted what I put in here as the last view, and that is that the sons of God are fallen angels, and the daughters of humans are simply daughters of humans. Okay? Now, there's no question that's the oldest view. The idea that there is a group of fallen angels who take on some kind of human form and decide to engage in relations with human daughters, and they actually have children together. Okay? I know that sounds really bizarre, but that's the oldest interpretation of this text. The biblical justification for that is there are several places in the Old Testament where angels are called sons of God. So that's usually what people point to. So for example, Job 1, verse 6, there's the assembly of this heavenly council. And many people believe Job, the book of Job, is actually older than the book of Genesis. And so book of Job describes this meeting of the heavenly council. And if you go to verse 6 of chapter 1, the NIV translates it angels, but the Hebrew says the sons of God came to this meeting when God assembled a council. Now, earlier in the book of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 5, we don't have any example of a heavenly council that we know of per se. But we do have, again, references later in the Old Testament where that phrase is used. So, for example, Psalm 29, verse 1, Psalm 82, verse 6, sons of the Most High. The idea that the angels are referred to as the sons of God. So you got three views. Sons of God are just the righteous children of Seth. The daughters of humans are the wicked daughters of Cain. Or the sons of God are the rulers and the despots. The daughters of human beings are daughters that they took to themselves as wives and lived in polygamy and various other kinds of promiscuous relationships. Or the third one, the sons of God are fallen angels, and the daughters of humans are simply daughters of humans. Okay? So, three very fascinating interpretations. Here's the good news. There's no major Christian doctrine that will live and die depending on how you interpret this text. Okay? So, we're not going to become apostatized today if you just pick one of these over the other. Okay? You're actually going to be in really good company because there's some great people that believe each one of these. Okay? And each one of them has its own interpretive difficulties, depending on which one you choose. It's the kind of thing where those who are proponents of one of the other views will very easily take some pot shots at your view, and they're hard to answer. So, again, just know that. So I fall in the category of believing number 3. So I go back to the oldest interpretation of this text, as challenging as it is and bizarre as it sounds. That's where I land. And I want to show you why. And again, I'm going to do this graciously because people will definitely disagree with what I'm about to offer you as the rationale for why I would interpret it that way. I would point you to the New Testament text to consider. So I want you to look with me at these passages out of the New Testament. The first one is 1 Peter 3. So obviously, many, many years later, Peter is writing a letter to the churches that are in Turkey, Asia Minor, being persecuted. And he's trying to encourage them. And he offers Jesus as an example to them. Jesus suffered, and so he wants to encourage them in their suffering. And so Peter has a very interesting paragraph in that first letter. If you'll look at 1 Peter 3, verse 18, Peter says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built." Fascinating passage of Scripture. What does this mean? And so let me just give you at least a take on it. Peter seems to be describing this is potentially what Peter's doing. He is describing what happens to Jesus between his death and his resurrection. That's one interpretation of that text. So what happened to Jesus when he died? Where did he go? What was going on with Jesus during that intervening period between his death and resurrection? Are y'all with me? Okay. Keep your finger there because I got to add to this so that we can help this make sense. Mostly. Go to 2 Peter 2, verse 4. Peter says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell," Tartarus is the word there, place of judgment, he says, "putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly." So he recounts the judgment of God, angels that have fallen, disobedient people during the time of Noah, references Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? Then look at Jude. I don't know when's the last time you read Jude. but you ought to read it often. It's only one page. It's really quick, okay? And you will run into him in heaven, and you don't want him asking you to just read my book. It made it all the way into the Bible, so you probably want to read it. Jude's interesting because you don't ever have to put a chapter reference to it because it's only one page. So look at Jude 5. He says, though you already know all this, I want to remind you that the Lord at one time delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling. These he's kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion, to serve as an example for all those who suffer the punishment of eternal life. Eternal fire, sorry. 1 Peter 3, 2 Peter 2, Jude 5 through 7. Here's at least the rationale for believing the answer lies behind door number 3 in our 3 options, okay? Here's the picture, that at some point, angels, because of the pervasiveness of sin, not exactly sure how all this would have happened, but you have this rebellion that took place, Satan evidently leading it, he himself a fallen angel, he has other fallen angels with him, and somehow at some point, some of these angels decided to actually fall even further and violate the boundaries that had been assigned to them and try to live as human beings and gave into the lust of that and engaged in relationships with human women and produced offspring. And that all occurs during this time of the degradation of humanity that God is watching unfold. God's answer was to judge the world with the flood. He also answered the angels by judging them and casting them into a place of temporary punishment awaiting their final doom. While they are in that place of temporary punishment, chains of punishment, if you will, Tartarus, this place of destruction and torture, they're imprisoned, if you will. When Jesus dies on the cross, and he dies for our sin, the angels, these fallen angels, they don't have a theological framework. They have no idea why the Son of God has died. It's not like they understand what's really going on. But it looks as if their master has won because the Son of God has actually died on a cross. And so the Spirit of God gives life to Christ, not yet resurrected, but he's made alive in the Spirit. And what Jesus then does is goes to those spirits in prison and he proclaims the victory of the cross. 1 Peter 3, he preaches. Now, Greek is very specific, much more than Hebrew. There's some people read that and they think, oh my goodness, so Jesus went and gave these spirits a second chance. Well, if that's what Peter would have intended, he had a word he could have chosen. He could have used the word euangelizo, which means to preach the good news. The good news is always preached with hope that people will respond. But Peter uses a different word in Greek, kerusso, which just means to proclaim. So there's no offer of salvation. There's no offer of hope. It's not preaching the good news. It's proclaiming the victory of the cross. And the idea is that Jesus proclaimed that victory of the cross to these spirits who are in prison to help them all understand that their impending judgment was certain and that his victory was about to be completely certain when he was going to be resurrected from the dead. And so these spirits who are in prison did not receive any hope. They just received the really, really bad news that they had not lost. They had actually lost for eternity. So the idea is that boundaries were violated because of the pervasiveness of sin. What did sin do to human beings? They wanted to be like God. What did sin do to these fallen angels? They wanted to be like humans. Bottom line is they're stepping out of their place. Human beings wanted to elevate themselves. These angels wanted to actually de-elevate themselves. Both of them marks of sin and evil. Both of them receiving judgment from God. The judgment from God was given to humanity because he wipes out humanity on the face of the earth, save Noah's family. He undoes his creation as just an expression of his grief and his anguish. He also judges these fallen angels and casts them in a place to a place of temporary punishment. And then, many years later, he allows his son to go and proclaim the truth and the victory of the power of the gospel over these fallen angels and the whole plan that they had given themselves to because of the leader that they had ascribed to, and that would have been Satan himself. The result of that, what some people say is, what you hear back in Genesis 6, notice what Moses tells us. It's a very interesting thing that he tells us, and it's really hard to know exactly what to do with it, as if the rest of this was easy. He says, my spirit's not going to contend. That word contend is only found here in the Hebrew Old Testament. God's not going to strive with human beings forever. They're mortal. Their days will be 120 years. You can interpret that one of two ways. That means in 120 years he's going to send the flood, or that could mean that these people are no longer going to live to be 900 years old anymore. I'm reducing their time on this earth. Either one of those is appropriate. And then he says this, the Nephilim in Hebrew were on the earth in those days. Well, that word Nephilim appears in Numbers 13:33. They're descendants of Enoch in Numbers 13. But this is the first time it appears in the Hebrew text. Who were they? Well, some translators translate it giants, but that's what the word Nephilim means. And we're not sure if Moses is telling us they're the offspring of these encounters or if this is just when they lived. Does that make sense? Because notice, look at how it's worded. He says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. Those children were the heroes of old, men of renown. So these were very famous people, evidently in the story of humanity. But their fame had to do with them making their own name. Their fame is also tied to their degradation and their sin, much like Genesis 11 in the Tower of Babel. They made a name for themselves, and they become a part of the story of judgment. In other words, even though they were famous for their misdeeds, not their deeds. Heroes to some human beings, men of renown perhaps. Were they the same as the Nephilim? We're not sure. Is he just saying this is when the Nephilim lived? We're not sure. Was he saying Nephilim were giants? We're not sure. The reason some people think that is because when you get to Numbers 13, y'all remember what the spies said when they went into Israel and they came back and reported? What did they say? They said, we look like what? Grasshoppers. In other words, they were so big. They were so powerful. Well, the family of Anak were known as military leaders. They were known for their prowess. I don't believe that Numbers 13 Nephilim has anything to do with the Genesis 6 Nephilim, because the Genesis 6 Nephilim are all going to drown in the flood. So they're not going to survive. In fact, everybody is going to be destroyed. It's interesting in the destruction. I hadn't thought much about this, but God doesn't mention the fish. I thought that was kind of fascinating. He's going to destroy all the creatures, but I guess presumably fish will survive it. Does that make sense? But regardless, were the Nephilim, were the descendants of these folks? You could argue that. Not sure. Were they giants? Perhaps. But the point is, this thing has so come off the rails. However you interpret sons of God and daughters of men, it's come off the rails so far that God finally says, enough. I'm going to judge all of it. Now, he doesn't specifically mention judgment of angels in Genesis 6. That's why some people say, don't think they're angels. However, I would just say, my response to that is, well, stay tuned. Because we're going to read that in the New Testament that he did do that. And Peter references the days of Noah. Now, some people say, well, Peter's saying that the Spirit of Christ was in Noah. In Noah. And so Noah was preaching righteousness, perhaps. But the fact that he mentions Christ, death, being made alive in the Spirit, proclaiming truth to the spirits who were disobedient during the days of Noah, that kind of connects it all for me in my understanding. But regardless, the point is, this thing has gone so far that God finally says, I'm going to judge all of it. And he does. And the good news is, though, notice how this passage ends. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So it ends on a hopeful note that will take us to the next part of the story. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you who join us online, thank you. and we're grateful you're a part of our study today, okay?